Well, when it comes to immigration, the major political parties in this country all favor immigration levels at or higher than the current levels, and they all favor economic immigration, although there are differences on how the immigration system should be administered. Now, the upstart People's Party of Canada favors an end to what it calls mass immigration and pledges to cut immigration by more than half if it forms government. So let's talk about immigration and the role it might play in this election and in the debate over Canada's long-term prosperity. Joining me now from Toronto is Jasmine Gill. She's the Director of Policy and Programs with the Century Initiative, a group that argues Canada should grow its population to 100 million by the year 2100 by relying on increased immigration, or at least in a major part. And joining me from Vancouver is David Green, professor at the Vancouver School of Economics with the University of British Columbia, who warns a big jump in immigration is not a good idea and not warranted. Thank you both for being here to talk about this. And Jasmine Gill, if I can, let me start with you. Your organization, the Century Initiative, is recommending a dramatic increase in the number of immigrants coming to Canada so we can reach a population, as I said, of 100 million by the end of the century. What's at stake if we don't?
Well, the initiative was born out of exactly that. We were looking at the fact that Canada's population is getting older. We are aging. Our fertility rate is quite low. It's at 1.54. Our replacement level is 2.1. We're also sensitive to the labor market shortages that we face today and will continue to face over the decades to come. Currently, there are 500,000 jobs that are unfilled. We expect over the course of the 2020s for 270,000 people to leave the labor force annually. That's 5,000 per week. And the Conference Board of Canada has stated that they expect there to be 1 million unfilled jobs by 2020. So looking at that, understanding that our population is aging, knowing that the result of that will be labor market shortages, as well as rising healthcare costs and old age spending, forces us to really consider seriously how ambitious are we in growing the scale of our population. And so Century Initiative came together around the idea that we need to be a bit more ambitious in achieving higher population growth, not only today and over the next couple of decades or over the course of my lifetime or your lifetime, right, but over the course of the entire century.
Okay, David, it's hard to imagine that a whole lot of Canadians would want poorer health care or smaller pensions if we can't afford to pay for those programs. What's your take on what the Century Initiative is proposing? Do we need steadily higher levels of immigration to maintain or expand our wealth in this country?
I would say that the evidence that we have to this point wouldn't support that claim. And I think the easiest place to look is in a set of recent reports from the Conference Board, actually. So the Conference Board is fairly supportive of the Century Initiative outlook. But if you look carefully at their numbers, what they're talking about is an important distinction between growing GDP, that is economic growth in terms of growing the whole pie, versus GDP per capita.
What's the difference there so people understand?
Yeah, so the difference is really that in thinking about GDP, we're thinking about the whole economic pie. How much are we producing in total? And when you're thinking about GDP per person or per capita, we're really talking about how much does each person get? How much is sort of your average take-home income? If you increase immigration a lot, of course, you're going to increase the population, and it actually stands to reason you're going to increase the size of the pie. We have more workers, we're going to produce more. The issue is that we're going to produce more, but we're also going to have more people asking for a share of the pie. So the real question is, what happens to the share that each person gets? That is, does the growth in population outstrip the growth in the total size of the pie? And what you find in the Conference Board's own numbers is that, in fact, GDP per capita grows less with the big immigration kind of scenarios that we're talking about relative to maintaining the course on the immigration policy as we have it now.
So are you saying we don't have a demographic time bomb to worry about?
So there's sort of two different questions, I think. One is, do we have a time bomb, as you're putting it? And the second is immigration the solution to that? So the first is most economists, all economists, view the economy not quite the same way a lot of other people do. So it's not a machine with missing cogs. So when you say, oh, I'm going to remove this many workers, the principle sounds like, okay, the economy is going to come to a halt. It's really an organic whole where new effort and new workers are directed to where they're needed, and new technologies are created as the scarcity evolve. So what will happen in response to more people retiring is not that the economy is going to break down, not that you look and say, oh, those 5 jobs are going to be empty, right, but rather that wages will adjust. They'll steer the workers towards where they're needed. We'll develop new technologies that work better when we have fewer workers. And essentially, the impact is not going to be a big negative time bomb.
All right. Okay. Jasmine, what's your response to that?
Well, on the first point around GDP per capita, those forecasts are on the basis of an older population in the labor force, so older workers earning higher incomes, as well as a lower share of labor force participation on the basis that we have a smaller population. Both of those two factors will undermine Canada's economic growth over the course of the long term. So GDP per capita, I would suggest, is perhaps not the best measure to address some of the issues that David mentioned, meaning are we sharing the benefits of growth broadly and across the entire spectrum of the population.
I guess why this is important. I don't want to get, I don't want to lose people too much in the numbers, but they're important to understand. Or to try and find the answer to the most basic question that people are confronted with. Do we need more immigrants in this country or not? And so we kind of required to sort of know that to kind of answer that question. You're saying the evidence is there, and David, you're saying it's not.
So let me go back to this question. So the Conference Board's kind of study of GDP per capita, which says clearly that their conclusion is GDP per capita would be lower with the big increases in immigration that we're talking about. But that's based ultimately on a sort of deeper literature of people who really have their hands on the data. And in all of those studies, there's a remarkable consensus amongst economists, which, as people know, is not a standard thing. But there's a remarkable consensus amongst economists who study the data that if you increase immigration, wages don't change very much, employment rates don't change very much, and GDP per capita does not change very much in the medium to long run. In other words, the effect is neutral. And that is a very, very standard finding in the results. The debate amongst economists is actually between, is the effect sort of neutral or is it actually slightly negative?
Yeah, what do you think of that, Jasmine?
So I would say that neutral is the worst case scenario, and that we can do even better. And also a lot of those projections are lacking a sensitivity analysis in terms of what would occur on softer factors like private investment. To what extent would that increase in scale such that we would gain in productivity and enable greater GDP growth? So I would just be a little bit cautious around the numbers and the assumptions around that. But even more so, when looking at immigration levels, I think there is a broad national consensus that immigration levels need to increase. It's to what level is the question. From our perspective at Century Initiative, we are looking to achieve more ambitious growth levels, and that's on the basis that immigration is going to account for 100% of population growth in a short time. We're about a decade away in the 2030s, the early to mid 2030s, when immigration will account for 100% of growth.
Let me jump. I'll come back to you in a moment, David. You've talked about the Jasmine. You've talked about the consensus, but we've seen a lot, and you've seen them, surveys that show that a lot of Canadians feel there are already too many immigrants coming to this country. They're uncomfortable with it. If more immigration is essential, why are we seeing that kind of resistance?
I think the reasons could be several. One being that where there is economic stagnation or income inequality, threats of job loss, those issues can trigger concerns around whether they're well placed or not, around whether newcomers will actually take jobs away from Canadians. We feel quite the opposite. Immigrants are job creators. The more people we have in Canada, the better our chances are at achieving collective prosperity.
David Green, given the concerns around immigration expressed by a number of Canadians, what are the risks of pushing ahead with higher immigration levels?
So just to come back to the message again, let me say again, Jasmine was talking about, maybe immigration would lead to extra investment, would lead to extra growth. That's all taken into account when we look at the impact on GDP per capita. In other words, there is no evidence for big gains. Now, on the other hand, there's no evidence for big losses either. The notion that immigration will dramatically lower wages or steal jobs, there's no evidence for that. And that means that the long-term, sort of risks of expanding are not on the economic side. They might be, as you're pointing out, on the political side, but they're not on the economic side. And let me also say, there's sort of a myth that we need immigration for demographic reasons, that the baby boom is going to get older, and that's going to lead to much higher proportions of workers who are, say, over age 65, and immigration can undo that. If you talk to demographers, that's not true. And the reason is because immigrants are on average slightly younger, but immigration is scattered across the age range. People bring in their parents, and we want them to bring in their parents. We want them to be part of this economy and feel like their whole family is welcome. And because of that, you don't change the age structure that much. You might push down the proportion who are over age 65 by a point or two, but not by a lot more. This is not a panacea. It's also not a gigantic time bomb, danger that it's going to destroy jobs. Like I said, I think the issues are probably more on the political side than the economic side, but it's not some huge economic boom waiting for us.
Jasmine, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, that gets me to the issue of strategic population growth. So this initiative of ours, Century Initiative, our thinking is not that it's simply in the worst characterization, a call to casually open borders, nor is it not thoughtful planning. So the reason why we have this goal that spans over the next 81 years is so that we can come together across different dimensions of policy thinking and think through what it will take to not just achieve population growth, but successful population growth. And so for us, it means exactly what are the qualities and characteristics, the skills, the talents that Canada needs? How are those best complemented by newcomers to this country? How can we better achieve greater economic outcomes for Canadians who are already living here? What do we need to do in terms of infrastructure and urban development to prepare our cities to accommodate population growth? Are educational institutions equipped to raise the next generation and the next few generations of talented Canadians? Do we have the job opportunities that would lead to economic prosperity for everyone? And finally, early childhood support. All of these different areas are very much part of a virtuous cycle that will feed off of itself and allow for population growth to occur incrementally, as we suggest, over the next 81 years, in a way that leads to a thriving and successful and prosperous population.
All right, let's finish on this. David, voters are going to hear a lot, I suspect, about immigration during this election campaign. The levels need to be higher. The levels need to be drastically cut from some parties. Are you worried about how this issue will be handled by the politicians during the campaign, and what should voters think about it?
I guess I'm a little worried, but I have a fair amount of faith in Canadians on this. I don't think somebody could go hard on the anti-immigration approach and really win well. Let me also say, everything that Jasmine says, I agree with. I mean, I think we want to be very careful about how we proceed with population growth. I just don't think there's any evidence for this quote-unquote virtuous cycle. There are no economic magic bullets. If there were, a country like China or India or Brazil, all of which are bigger than us in GDP, would be in that virtuous cycle, and they're not. I mean, the point is that we need to do exactly what Jasmine said, but by carefully looking at the evidence, and the evidence doesn't support this claim that population growth is the magic bullet.
All right, Jasmine, let me hear from you on how you think this will be handled in the campaign and how you think it should be handled and what voters should be thinking about.
Well, I don't think immigration is at all an election issue, and it should not be the cause of any divide over the course of this election or any election. This is very much a long-term imperative for Canada, and I feel as though, although there are concerns that should be raised and discussed, and we should talk openly about immigration levels. On the whole, Canadians are very accepting of immigration, and it is our latent strength in Canada. We have a successful model of accommodating and integrating immigrants, and a wonderfully open approach to diversity and pluralism. Okay. That is something we should build on, and we feel greatly that it should be scaled.
All right, we'll have to end it on that, but I want to thank you both for your time for this important conversation. Jasmine Gill in Toronto, David Green in Vancouver. Thank you both.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.